Welcome everyone to this Riverkeeper webinar event. Thank you for coming. I'm Dan Shapley. I am the co-director of Riverkeeper's Science and Patrol program with my colleague Jon Lipscomb, who's joined me here. He's also our boat captain and vice president. And Riverkeeper is dedicated to the protection of the Hudson River and the drinking water supplies that we rely on. And we're excited tonight for this conversation with our very good friend, the filmmaker, writer, adventurer, and environmental activist, Jon Bowermaster. Jon Bowermaster is Riverkeeper's 2022 Hudson Hero honoree. We will be honoring Jon at our new annual gala event, the Summer Splash, which is happening in just 2 weeks on June 16th at Boscobel. It'll be excellent food, excellent people, excellent views of the river. And we hope that you'll join us for this event. You can look for, you'll see the chat link before you, and that link will take you to a site allowing you to buy a ticket. We hope you'll consider doing so. The site also has an auction that it's running, and I encourage you to check out some of the really great items and experiences on that auction and help Riverkeeper out. Helps us to keep fighting for this river. So thank you for your help. Now, typically, Jon Bowermaster is the one asking the questions, whether he's behind the camera for one of his Ocean's 8 films or hosting his show, The Green Radio Hour on Radio Kingston. He's the one doing the questioning. But today, Jon Lipscomb and I will be able to ask him questions. And we've both been on the other end of it, so we're excited for our chance here today. If you in the audience have questions for Jon, you can use the Q&A function, which is the little icon at the bottom of your screen. And you can put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll take a look at those and ask some of them along the way as well. So about Jon Bowermaster. Jon is our neighbor. He lives here in the Hudson Valley, but he really has lived a truly adventurous life. We know him as a filmmaker, and we'll get to that. He's also a radio show host, as I mentioned, and he's an author, he's a teacher. He founded and published a newspaper. The list goes on. His films and his books have taken him to Antarctica, the Galapagos Islands, the Gulf of Mexico, even the capital of New York, Albany, and on several occasions, Riverkeeper's patrol boat on the Hudson River with our friend Jon Lipscomb. His films have done more than tell stories about adventurous people. They've done more than taken Jon Bowermaster on adventures himself. They've also raised awareness about incredibly important issues here and around and facing the globe, ranging from fracking, the PCB's cleanup of the Hudson River, to the promise of removing derelict dams right here in our midst to restore habitat for Hudson River fish. His series of films about our river, River at Risk and The Hope on the Hudson, each of these films is extraordinary on their own. As a set, they're truly a remarkable body of work. We didn't know it when we first started collaborating with Jon, but he really has become one of Riverkeeper's most important partners and friends, and with that, really one of the river's most important partners and friends. So with that, Mr. Bowermaster, your first question, just how many films and books have you produced and created, and how many of them about the Hudson, and why the Hudson?
Wow, now I'm gonna have to turn on my, put that chip in with that memory card. Thank you, Dan. Hello, Jon. Hello, all 34 of you out there. It's very fun to have this conversation. I will say that the three of us on screen do share one thing in common, is that we all arrive at this role as activists, as storytellers. I'm not the only one. Dan was a journalist and a reporter. Jon has made films of super high quality, and I've kind of morphed from journalism to activism as well. So I like that linkage. The question was how many books and films, etc. You know, I'm really old, so I've accumulated lots of, I have a long trail, so to speak. But yeah, I started as a print journalist. When I went to college, I think they asked you what you want to be when you grow up, and I said I wanted to be a sports reporter. I tried that for a couple of years, boring, awful. I always knew, I'm very fortunate. I knew from quite a young age that I wanted to be a writer. And I grew up in the Midwest, far from the oceans, etc. But I was an ardent reader, and I think reading really turned me on to exploring the world and adventure and travel, etc. Which, when I do talks in schools, teachers really love to hear, because we all like encourage kids to read. If I go through and count, 11 books and now up over 30 documentary films. I morphed from print into filmmaking due to a pretty long relationship with National Geographic. They were funding different projects and expeditions we were doing. And as part of that funding, they said, well, you're going out there, you're kind of in these remote areas. You should not just bring back print stories, you should bring back films. So for a decade or so, we did that. And we made a series of films that ran on the National Geographic Channel internationally for many, many years. But really since 2010, I've only made films. I've barely written a sentence. I hate to admit, but it's been a good run. And then in regard to the Hudson River project, I've lived here in the Hudson Valley for 34 years now, and it just made sense it's not rocket science. I realized you don't have to travel halfway around the world to find good stories and to find good films, to find a good adventure, to find good environmental stories. There's so many of them right here in our backyards. So in 2015 or so, and that's that's the beauty of films. It's kind of a collaborative process. So we started making films about the Hudson Valley and the Hudson River, and thus the long collaboration with Riverkeeper.
Indeed. One of the things that we love about these films is that they have a purpose, and they're trying to achieve, trying to help achieve something, or achieve something in turning public opinion, or influencing a decision maker. So I'm really curious, which of the films that you've done do you feel has really had the most impact? And, how do you see media in general, or these films really, what role do they play in activism?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I think about this with some frequency, is that I consider myself still a writer and a filmmaker, and I guess a journalist, but at a certain point, and I know when it was about a decade ago, I turned the switch and agreed that really I could accept that description as activist as well. I'm a big fan of journalism, and I think that you have to be cautious about taking sides. But at a certain point, after doing it for 30 or 40 years, I think you gain the authority to choose a side. And I think we started doing that in 2012 with our film Dear Governor Cuomo, which was all about encouraging the governor to ban fracking in New York State. I mean, at that point, I clearly made a decision that I was going to not just tell a story that had two sides to it, but that I was going to make a choice and tell a story that was very one-sided, which is fracking is bad, stop it. And it's kind of continued since then. But I do caution, because I do go into journalism schools on occasion, I do caution young journalists and young people of any age, and people who use social media, is that you have to kind of earn the right, I think, to have that kind of voice. I don't want 25-year-olds really, making that decision on their own without kind of trying to look at both sides first. I think you have to kind of gain that option. At least, I don't know, Dan, you've been a reporter out there. I'm sure you've experienced the same thing. Is, at what point does journalism separate from activism, and can it exist? Can it cross over?
Yeah, I made a similar choice at some point, where I was a reporter, and for me there were two kind of influences on that decision. One was a feeling that I had, could see where the truth and the right was, and I wanted to work on it. And the other was the community of people that I wanted to work with on those things. And those two things brought me to work for Riverkeeper. And
yeah. No, I totally get it. And plus, I reached a point where you can only call the energy companies, the oil companies, so many times and get either no response or a fictional response, before you just say, screw it, I'm not calling you anymore. But you have to earn, as a journalist, I think you have to earn that right. You can't start out as a young journalist with that attitude.
So I'm up for a question, but I also want to tell a story about Dan based on what he just said. I remember a meeting in Kingston where I was employed by Riverkeeper and Dan was a reporter. And we were talking about this, an issue, a very important issue. I don't want to get sidetracked by the issue. And we walked out in the dark at the museum and Dan came up and I didn't really know him. I knew his name, but I didn't know him. And he said, I would really like to move from writing about people working for the river to actually working for the river myself. So I was there. So John, you started to answer this question. You said 10 years ago, a switch flipped for you, but every environmental activist can often trace their start back to an event or an issue that flicked that switch for them. Can you remember what it was that turned you from a documentarian to a warrior, an activist?
Well, two things. One is that as Dan referenced it, I started a weekly newspaper when I was 22 years old, 23 years old. And I have the bound volumes of that, and I go back through them every once in a while. And I'm actually very happy about how many environmental stories are in those weekly newspapers. I mean, I've been on this subject. I've been writing about, filming about, talking about these subjects for a long time. But the trigger here in the Hudson Valley was that fracking issue. To me, it was just so clearly wrong. But I remember, a very specific day, we had met a bunch of hardcore anti-fracking activists, and they had tried to enlist our help in publicizing, and they were sitting around our kitchen table and talking about the importance of the issue. And they said, and there was a concert in the works, and we were going to plan this concert, we're going to draw a lot of attention to it. And then someone said, oh, we should make a film. And I was standing on the kind of perimeter of the room, and I kind of backed off because I was thinking, oh no, I'm not sure this is really where I want to go. But then of course, I put my hand up, and we made a film, Dear Governor Cuomo, which is all about, the anti-fracking effort. We know that the governor watched it. We know that his mother watched it. We know that his sister and brother watched it. We know that thousands of people across the state watched it. We know it reinvigorated them at a moment when the anti-fracking effort in New York State was kind of on the fence. And that was a really great example to me of how media can make a difference. And so since then, and that was 2012. 2011, 2012. So since then, I've been full on telling these stories about not just the Hudson River and the Hudson Valley, but I continue to make feature films as well. In 2018, 2019, we put out a film called The Ghost Fleet, which was all about the global plight of fishing slaves around the world. In fact, most men, and they are all men, who work on commercial fishing boats, mostly out of Southeast Asia, are slaves. So I continue to, tell these local stories, but I do like keeping my hand in kind of bigger, broader international stories as well.
Good. So one more for me. So guys like you who've done all these expedition films, and we've looked at your resume, Antarctica.
Guys like you, come on.
Guys like you usually have a couple whopper of adventure stories. Pick just one example that our people have joined us here will appreciate the kind of fine edge you're walking on when you're doing these expedition films.
Yeah. I've always been a storyteller. And in the early 90s, I guess, I connected with a really great photographer, an adventure photographer. And I knew how to get stories published. He knew how to find really hardcore adventures. So we went for a decade out around the world and just accumulated these first descents of wild rivers, wild remote rivers. We climbed stuff I should never have been climbing. I mean, I've always just by chance kind of fallen into the first thing I've ever done is like the biggest thing anyone could do, like running class 5 rapids on the Futaleufú in Chile, or diving to 100 feet in Polynesia on like the third day I dove. And I mean, it's not particularly braggadocious stuff. It's stuff you shouldn't actually be doing, but I've always kind of started at the high end. And one of the things this photographer buddy and I started doing is we discovered that sea kayaks were a really great really great tool for getting us into places, because we were really interested in ocean issues and coastal issues and environmental issues on oceans and coasts. That really was the driving force. And so we did a ton of traveling around the world. And then I proposed this notion to National Geographic that we take on a 10-year-long project where we would go around the world, one continent at a time, with sea kayaks and bring back environmental stories. And for those of you who only remember National Geographic or know of National Geographic by the magazine, the yellow bordered magazine, it's a big content hungry media company. They need stories. So they were funding me. We went out. They had the advantage of the fact that I could actually write, because oftentimes they fund expeditions where they don't have a writer on the team, and then they have to kind of figure that out at the end. So here they've got me. I can write. I can organize these trips. I'd learned a lot from my first experience in Antarctica, but that's almost an older story. But the sea kayak expeditions were my own brainchild. We went around the world. We went to the Aleutian Islands, French Polynesia, Vietnam, the Altiplano of South America, Gabon, Tasmania, Croatia, and back to Antarctica. And it was my small teams and I, and we would go out and bring back these very fun stories. But the very first one, back to your question, was in the Aleutian Islands. There's like a diamond necklace hangs between Russia and Alaska.
A fairly windy place.
Exactly. Well, the Aleuts knew it as the birthplace of the winds. And we got, per John Lipscomb's experience, I needed to charter or rent or I needed to hire a boat captain who would take us across a really wild 50-mile stretch of ocean between Alaska and the first big Aleutian island. There's 50 miles between Dutch Harbor and Nikolsky. Dutch Harbor from the Deadliest Catch. And those guys go out there in February, March, when it's really cold. We're going out there at the height of summer, which is June and July. But even in June and July, it's still cold and windy. So, long story. We arrive in Dutch Harbor. The boat that's supposed to carry us out there, the guy doesn't actually have a boat, but we only discovered that when we could walk out onto the dock. So then I'm, for a couple of days, walking up and down the docks, trying with a wad of cash in my hand, saying, who among you will carry us out across this wild stretch, for which virtually none of them were insured. They couldn't go that far from Dutch Harbor. One guy had a new boat. He had a big debt. And he took us. He said, "Okay, I'll do it." So he carried us out there, dropped us off. So for 4 or 5 weeks, we're in the middle of the Aleutian Islands, the birthplace of the winds, cold water, 36 degrees. So you're in kayaks. And the beauty of the trip was we kayaked among this small group of 5 islands known as the Islands of 4 Mountains. And we climbed the volcanoes, the still active volcanoes, and just made this beautiful story of kayaking and these snow-capped volcanoes and this incredible adventure in cold water. And for 4 or 5 weeks, we didn't see nobody. We heard no plane overhead. We saw no boat on the horizon. And the shores were still, of these remote islands, were still kind of littered. Littered's a little harsh, but there was still evidence of man. Even in this most remote place, there was stuff washing up on these beaches from boats and foreign places. But that was out there. You got dropped off. There was no rescue. I mean, the rescue was impossible. We were 150 miles at least from the closest helicopter or anything. We were just 4 persons. And one of the youngest of the team came to me one day. We'd climbed this 6,000-foot volcano. It was covered with snow. And he said, "Do you mind if I glissade, slide on my butt down this volcano, because it'll be faster than walking?" But the problem was when the snow ran out, it turned into just this horrible, like scree of death. And I said, "Well, no, you can do it, but if you get hurt, we're not carrying you out. You're on your own." So he walked down. But to your specific question, that was probably the boldest thing we've ever done. And that's said based on having kayaked 600 miles down the coast or down the peninsula of Antarctica, et cetera. But the Aleutian Islands were the big one. And that was the first of this 10-year-long project that then ended again back in Antarctica.
Nice. That registers on the adventure scale.
Yeah, that was a big adventure.
That counts.
Yeah.
There's one detail though I'm hung up on as someone who loves writing. Did you say that National Geographic would not send, they would forget to send writers on these things? How is that?
It wasn't that.
Do they need my number? Because I can offer it.
It wasn't that they would forget, but they would get these proposals and or people who'd gone out and done incredible things, but they didn't necessarily have a writer on the team. So then they would have to hire a writer to come in and paste it together. Or that's often what the staff of writers at National Geographic in Washington, D.C. would do, is kind of cobble these pieces together based on interviewing people who had participated in these adventures. But they wouldn't have it was kind of rare actually that there would be a singular writer on the adventure. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, if you've just joined us, I'm Dan Shapley with Riverkeeper. My colleague Jon Lipscomb and I are interviewing Jon Bowermaster, the filmmaker, adventurer. He's going to be receiving our Hudson Hero Award at our Summer Splash event in 2 weeks. And we encourage you to purchase tickets to join us for that event and ask questions of Jon at that time. We also have the Q&A box open. So if you have a question for Jon, please put your question in there and we will be happy to ask him. But Jon, before that, let me ask you, you mentioned the ghost fleet, which, is a topic that is, as dark as it gets. Some of the issues that you're covering are there's not an obvious note of optimism in all of these environmental stories. How do you find hope, and how did you pivot from the Hudson River at Risk to the Hope on the Hudson series as part of that? And I think we'll put the links into those in the chat as you go, so folks who haven't watched them all can find their way after the talk.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a specific date, et cetera, but I think it was around 2015 where my team and I decided that we were very interested in making films about environmental issues here in the Hudson Valley. And it was pretty easy, as you guys know better than I, it was pretty easy to identify, a half dozen, 7, 8 different issues in the Hudson River that were so problematic, environmental issues, ranging from PCBs still in the river to a leaky nuclear power plant to the transport of oil and gas by train and barge and pipeline up and down the river. Those stories were easy to identify, and we weren't telling them for the first time. We were kind of updating and working with Riverkeeper and others to really create tools so that you guys could use our storytelling experience and to go out and educate and share and try and elicit more involvement for your campaigns, et cetera. So we kind of joined arms in working together as storytellers and activists, et cetera. Yeah, so it's that river, and I came up with this, again, I didn't start it. I wish I could say I thought of this in advance, but I didn't really think of it in advance. It just kind of came from having made one film after another. But we made, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 films under this moniker of the Hudson River at Risk. And I took them around the state. When we started that, my assistant spent days compiling a list of environmental organizations up and down the Hudson River that work on environmental issues. And we came up with a list of more than 300 groups. So, here in the Hudson Valley, we're obviously a little spoiled. We have 3 big groups Riverkeeper, Scenic Hudson, Clearwater, et cetera. But there's another almost more than 300 groups who are dedicated to working on issues, which to us was phenomenal. So it was pretty easy for me. Then we have a finished film. I call them up. I say, can you get your gang together? I'll bring it to the firehouse, to the university, to the library, whatever. We'll show the film. And that went on for, a good year plus. And, at a certain point, we had 5 or 6 or 7 films we could juggle. We could do a whole night of programming. And I took them around and we got a lot of, positive response to the films, but the subject matter was still pretty harsh. You're talking about environmental destruction. And after a year or a year and a half, I got bummed out. And I said, here we live in this beautiful place, we're trying to, share, educate our neighbors and fellows with these stories. But every time I show these films, they end with on such a not sour but dour note. The bomb trains are going to come off the rails and explode and run into the river. The PCBs are going to have killed all the fish. The nuclear power plant's going to leak, etc. And so I specifically remember pivoting in my brain and saying, we have to tell more positive stories because I know they're out there. So, a few years into it, that we started this Hope on the Hudson series. I think it's up over now. Now it's over 10 films, 10 plus films, including a brand new one, which we're going to share in July, all about the sailing boat Apollonia, which has been doing this really unique project of delivering goods up and down the river without fossil fuels. But the Hope on the Hudson series was great. One more self promo. It's actually you can Google, you can search Hope on the Hudson on Amazon Prime, and people around the world can literally watch all 9 at that point 9 films. So we're sharing our Hope on the Hope on the Hudson films with people around the world, which is great. And that took us into more positive stories, like the Riverkeeper piece about undamming the mill dams that line the tributaries of the Hudson. Took us into a bunch of agricultural stories. Agriculture and the river are obviously linked because minus clean water, you don't get clean food. And that's been a really good run. And so we're continuing to do that. I'm not against telling the tough stories. We're working on a bigger film about the impacts of sea level rise on the Hudson and the communities that line the river, et cetera. But there's there's so much subject matter out there. It's actually a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
All right, I'm up. So 2 questions that are related, Jon. Throughout your career, you've worked with a whole bunch of environmentalists, working on a wide variety of issues. And I'm curious if you have settled on what qualities or, attributes the successful ones share. What makes the good advocates, good environmental advocates, good?
Yeah, well, I think I'm sure you've heard me talk about this. I mean, I'm such a big fan, and where I find optimism in this work is in the people who I call accidental environmentalists. People who did not intend, they didn't study biology or environmental science or activism or politics or anything, but all of a sudden they've got a pipeline in their backyard, or there's a leak across the street or something, and these people just turn into full-on 24/7 activists usually for their issue, and oftentimes they grow beyond that. I've witnessed it, I've experienced it here in the Hudson Valley, but we've made films across the country that feature people just like that. And we made a film 2015 called Dear Governor Brown as part of my Dear series, and we looked at Jerry Brown's relationship with environmental damage in California, which was, he wasn't quite as green as he claimed to be. But at that point, we interviewed a young girl who's 11 years old who lived in urban LA, and she was suffering from nosebleeds and asthma. And it's because right next door they were fracking in urban LA, right next to her house. And she was so articulate. We filmed her with her mother, and just I think a week ago or a few days ago, she won the Goldman Prize, which is the Goldman Award goes to the leading kind of this environmental activist, one per continent, so six persons per year, and she was the representative of North America. So we met her when she was 11. She's now 17, 18 years old, and I love that story. I mean, she didn't wake up one day, I want to be an environmental activist. It just came upon her. And I've met so many people like that around the country, around the world, but especially here in the Hudson Valley, which that's what gives me optimism.
So is it a rage that they hold? Is it an unwillingness to accept what's being pushed at them? Is it rage?
I think it is, and a lot of it has to do with in very specific terms, personal safety. This young girl I just mentioned is because she was sick, or she'd been made sick. Persons I met in the Hudson Valley that you guys know quite well, their families have been made sick by pollutions, et cetera, and that definitely pisses you off. Right. And I hear your question about rage. I don't think that rage has to be part of every environmental activism, but it's not a bad tool.
Right. All right. So related, you wrote this great book with a long title. I'm going to have to give you some counseling on titles maybe, but the title of the book is Wildebeest in a Rainstorm: Profiles of Our Most Intriguing Adventurers, Conservationists, Shagbags, and Wanderers. And in it, you gave me a copy. And
it's got great. 20 interviews of really interesting environmental activists around the world. Yeah,
it's a great series of essays, we could call it. And you talked to David Brower, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, and something that he said that you documented has resonated with me, and it causes some discomfort within Riverkeeper, I can tell you, because he said, and I believe, when you compromise, you lose. And I have taken that as gospel. And I'm wondering, after your experience with all these various environmentalists, whether you are of that school or whether you have, whether compromise, an intellectual compromise is the way you see us going and achieving better results.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that book really was put together as profiles of really interesting persons in the environmental and adventure world who I'd had the good fortune to work and travel with, et cetera. David Brower was a particularly great role model. And he's the man who invented this notion of using media to change or to influence environmental law. He would go out with Ansel Adams, into threatened areas of California, and they would produce these beautiful books for the Sierra Club, which David Brower started. And beautiful books of words and photographs by Ansel Adams. And then they would print these big books, and they'd bring them to Washington, D.C. That was a day when they could literally drop into congresspersons' offices. They would lay a copy of the book on the desk of every congressman and every senator. And then they would, as a way to try and influence them to set aside lands and have them be federally protected. And they were able to gain incredible successes via that, using media to influence law, legislation, politics, etc. So yeah, later in his wasn't so long before he died, I had the opportunity to meet him. We went to a couple of really interesting kind of honorifics that featured him, and that's when he talked to me about that issue that you raised. That's not my personality, personally. I'm more I'm not as confrontational, personally. I believe that small steps are actually an interesting way. The rage, the anger route, it can work. It does work sometimes. But I think in the interim, we have to be comfortable with making small steps on the way up the ladder, rather than standing at the bottom of the ladder and shouting and maybe not getting what we want. Maybe shouting sometimes helps. Certainly, there are examples, but yeah, that wouldn't be my take. I'm much more of an accommodator with a goal, but not. You're not going to find. Well, you know me. You're not going to find me yelling at people.
No.
Although I've seen you, Jon Lipscomb, yell at a couple people, usually for leaving too much wake.
All right, Dan, you're up.
We could add to the list.
Yeah.
Question from the audience. It's not just Wake. This is an interesting question. I think you know, I'm curious if you have any good answers to this. But the question is from the perspective of geologic time. You know that as the questioner says, human history is just a fart in geological time. That's a quote. So many of our environmental problems are playing out on this grand time scale, you know, right? That the changes are geologic in nature, even if they're happening in a now more of a human scale time. But the changes that we've made to the environment are so vast in such an unfathomably short time in the span of the life of the Earth. The question is, are there films or books or other efforts to sort of capture this that actually activate citizen engagement and action? So is there anything that you've found inspiring that turns people's mind onto that vast scale, but actually gets them to a place where they feel they can take action? Is there anything? It's a tough one. I'm curious if you have anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting, you know, like all of us, I can play these, or I can respond to these kinds of questions and answers. I can respond representing either side or both sides. You know, we made a film in 2015 called Dear President Obama. We did it with Mark Ruffalo, and we looked at, you know, the president's then all of the above energy policies and kind of encouraging him to do better. That same year, 2015, Leo DiCaprio made a movie about you know, global warming and climate change. Naomi Klein made a movie about the same issue. Josh Fox made a movie about the same issue. A guy, and I'm going to forget his name, but he'd won an Academy Award for making a movie about Wall Street. Made a film about climate change. Did any of them make a difference? I mean, did the register change? I'm not convinced. You know, so even at the same time that I'm a big promoter of the fact that media can make a difference, I think sometimes we target not necessarily the wrong audience, but the same audiences, you know. So where I take some comfort in these local stories is that I literally can take our Hudson River Stories films, whether they're the Hudson River Risk or the Hope on the Hudson films, I can take them into a firehouse in New Baltimore, a pretty conservative neighborhood, and show them and get really good feedback, really good reaction. Or I can take them into the Basilica in Hudson, which is not a conservative place. Or I can take them to Bard College, which again is not a conservative place. That's what I like, is taking them in and trying and just seeing the feedback I get. So I'm not sure if that quite gets to the question, or.
Yeah, and it sounds like, and one thing that's interesting to me is that it's part of a ecosystem of activism. Like on its own, the films can do something on its own, you know, letters to the governor can do something, you know, what all of these things, each on their own, are unlikely to move the needle, but when they stack up, when they're coordinated, when there's a when they have a good feedback among them, then we really see the power, and you can really see the change. So sometimes it seems like you know, whether that film is falling into fertile ground or really being used by allies and by other partners makes a big difference.
Yeah, well, and that's great, Dan. I think that's where this partnership between my storytelling skills and Riverkeeper and others, it has really worked, because, you know, you guys know the routes to get, you have the ability to get to people, and I have the ability to kind of tell a story and tell the story that you guys are focused on, and hopefully that's a great way to find change. And I think it's worked. We've had some great examples. The piece we made about the Coast Guard's desire to allow cargo ships loaded with crude oil to park on the Hudson was a great example. You know, we made a short film. It was short. It was 7.5 minutes long. But you guys were very active in promoting the issue. You used the film as a tool to kind of educate people. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but the Coast Guard got 10,000 plus postcard saying, this is silly, don't do it. And that was such a great example of kind of working together to get this message out.
So Dan, should I go to the next question? Or are you queuing up for the next?
Well, we have another audience question. Why don't we try this one? And I'll just remind everyone, the Q&A box is where to put your questions. If you have a question that you'd like to ask our guest, Jon Bowermaster, our friend here. So this question is, what can we do to protect the Hudson River from the installation of the transmission cables that would bring electricity from Canada to New York City, the Chippy transmission cable? That's not one I think that you've had a feature-length film on yet.
No, I mean, it's a subject that I'm super interested in, that whole notion of how do we energize our system, our economy. I mean, it's something we wrestle with all the time. Just because we believe in sustainability and renewable energy, et cetera, doesn't mean that we don't all still need power, and it's got to come from somewhere. We can't, it's not magical thinking. Chippy is interesting, what's happening with the proposed natural gas plants in and around New York City is interesting. And on the radio show, I've done a few episodes where we featured what I call kind of solar v solar campaigns, like that old Mad Magazine, Spy versus Spy, where you've got a community that 80% of everyone in town wants solar energy, but they're not quite sure of the best way to deliver it. Anyway, I think those energy issues is something that's going to be fascinating in our storytelling process going forward, and in your activist process. In terms of answering the question, is Chippy good or bad? I mean, I'd leave that up to you guys. But it's not a story we've told yet, but I definitely want to. The one part of it that I know you guys have focused on and that I'm most curious about is running a cable under or through the trough of the Hudson Valley or the Hudson River. What does that do to the drinking water? 106,000 persons in the Hudson Valley get their drinking water straight from the Hudson. What does running a cable down the river, how does that affect them? And I know, Dan, that's something you and the Hudson 7 worked on extensively.
Indeed. Is there anything you wanted to add, John?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And we do have a section on our website that deals with the Chippy project. It has a tremendous, it's another whole hour conversation, of course, and it has terrible consequences for the people in Eastern Canada where the reservoirs were built and the dams were built and their food web is being poisoned. It has terrible consequences for the Hudson, where for 100 miles plus, it's going to be jet plowed into a trench. It's got consequences for the reach near the communities that drink river water, as John is talking about, when legacy contaminants are resuspended during the installation, how much of that is going to get into the intakes. We tried to stop it, but the Public Service Commission has now approved it. So I've got to say that this is looking like one that is lost. That said, there are the details of the installation that are still in play. And there's a second cable, which will have much less in Hudson. The route is much less in the Hudson than Chippy. So we're working with that developer, and we're going to be working with regulators to try and minimize the consequences from installation. But I'm afraid that the Chippy project fight is lost. And that's for me personally. I've been with Riverkeeper 22 years. That's the biggest failure of my time, and it's hard to accept, but you just have to go and fight another fight. I think it's time for a last question. Is that right, Dan?
Yes, sir.
So John, give our viewers an idea of what you have in the works. What are you working on? Let's in the Hudson specifically. What's coming out soon? What are you working on?
Yeah. Well, as you guys well know, because you have a constant observation of the Hudson River for the last couple of years, there's been a 65-foot sailboat sailing up and down the river from Hudson to New York City and back, stopping in a dozen ports and delivering goods, all powered by wind, not by diesel. The ship is called the schooner Apollonia. I met the captain is Sam Merritt. I met him, 2014, 2015, when this was just kind of a dream for him, a very quixotic dream, delivering goods by sailboat. Who does that anymore? I mean, the Hudson River used to be filled at any moment with, at some point, it was 1,200 schooners, with all loaded with goods. But today, Sam Merritt and his Apollonia is the only sail freight boat in the country. So, and he's operating up and down the Hudson. And anyway, when I first met Sam in 2015, I thought this is going to be an incredible film. And so we started slowly kind of, paying attention. Sam, what are you up to? What's the status, et cetera. He had found this boat in the backyard of a suburban Boston house. It hadn't been in the water for 30 years. They hooked up the engine, they motored it back to Hudson. And then for a few years, every year they built the booms, the masts, they knitted the sail, they sewed the sails, et cetera. And then in the spring of 2020, really at the height of COVID, he started delivering malt and corn and beer. I accuse him of being the new age Joe Kennedy. He's making his fortune off of booze runs up and down the river, because there's so many breweries and distillers now who are hungry for Hudson Valley grains and corns and malt, et cetera. So anyway, we've been following Sam and his boat for a couple of years, and that film literally is just, it's minutes away from being finished. We're gonna start showing it in July and August. It's very beautiful, and it has, Sam's very charismatic, has this kind of quixotic dream, but with this serious issue of, do you really have to have everything absolutely overnight? Could you wait a few days? It's the anti-Amazon story, so it melds in kind of an international look. And we have, really profound archival footage of, 200 container boats sitting off the port of Long Beach, waiting to unload, or the Evergreen, in the Suez Canal going askew and blocking traffic for a week and shutting down international shipping. So what he's doing with this sailboat has these kind of bigger picture stories. So that'll be out. My Dear series, we started with Dear Governor Cuomo, focused on the fracking issue. We made Dear President Obama, looking at his all of the above energy policies. We made a film, Dear Governor Brown, looking at Jerry Brown and the reality of his green policies. And next month, well, actually June 22nd, debuts film Dear President Biden, looking at the Biden green campaign promises and the reality of. It's very interesting story, very complicated, obviously. When we were out filming this spring in Virginia and Texas and Louisiana and Iowa and DC and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, et cetera, we were asking, we were interviewing activists, and activists were telling people to leave, to ask Joe Biden to leave fossil fuels in the ground. This is exactly at the moment that the war in Ukraine broke out. And what was the Biden administration's reaction? Ramp up oil production and ship it to Europe, which is, from our perspective, my perspective, is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Such a golden opportunity to push environmental and renewable energies rather than reward the oil and gas industry, which is what this did. At the moment, things are a little in abeyance because mostly what the oil and gas industry has been providing is just their supplies. They're not drilling new, or they're not processing new stuff. But if they get into a position where the fossil fuel companies in the United States are creating new oil and gas and liquefying natural gas to send to Europe, and that's going to push back climate change by a generation, by 20, 25 years. So it's a short film, 40 minutes, but it's powerful. And then here in the Hudson River, we've got great stuff going on. We've been working on it for a couple of years, been gathering the skeleton of a film about the impacts of sea level rise on the Hudson River. Literally from the Verrazano Bridge to the Erie Canal, and how communities are preparing or not preparing for climate change and sea level rise. And then we've got kind of a bigger project going on, kind of taking a step back, because we've been kind of immersed in these shorter films for a long time. And so we thought now would be the Hudson Valley has gotten so much press in the last couple of years, in part due to COVID and the population's booming and all of that stuff. And we thought now might be a really good time to take a step back and provide a picture of the Hudson River and the Hudson River Valley at a moment when things are changing and changing fast, and make a film that addresses people who've just parachuted in. So you've never been to the Hudson Valley, you don't really know the Hudson River, and you've just landed, and here's a film that brings you up to speed on, and it's environmentally influenced. I mean, so here's what's going on in the environmental world here, with a goal of it's a feature film, a goal of sharing it with not just our neighbors, but with an international audience. And I think that's going to be super powerful film. So we're busy. I could go on, actually.
I'm going to plug two things. I'm going to give shout out to your crew, the crew that we've worked with the most, Devin Pickering and Chris Rahm. They're a delight to work with, and they work really hard, and they make beautiful, beautiful images. And then I want to also plug the film you just finished for us, which is a second dam removal film called One Dam at a Time, and it'll be rolling out to strategic screenings after COVID gives us a break.
Yeah, we're calling it One Dam at a Time.
Right.
And we've created it in English and Spanish, so we can kind of introduce it into a broader audience.
Wonderful.
So we do have another question from the audience on this topic of, ideas for you, John, to explore.
Yeah, I'm wide open. I want ideas. Yeah.
Maybe whether you've thought about this one, but the issue of PFAS, the contaminant that's affected Newburgh's drinking water supply, but not just Newburgh, as the testing continues in around New York State, and especially in the lower mid-Hudson Valley, we're seeing water supplies, contaminated with low levels, but significant levels of these chemicals that are quite persistent, very persistent. They're called forever chemicals and toxic, and not what we want in drinking water, but they're there. So the question is, is there any future in covering the PFAS issue?
Yeah. Well, Dan, I do a weekly radio show on Radio Kingston called the Green Radio Hour. You and I have talked about this issue on the radio show on multiple occasions. It is one of my, and I know it's yours too, it's one of my greatest fears, is that this kind of contamination, chemical pollution in our aquifers, in our water, underground water sources, is only, we're going to discover it more and more and more. We've obviously, you've seen the issues in Michigan and New York State. Newburgh is a great example, but it was preceded by Hoosick Falls. And it was all preceded by GE dumping PCBs in the river. We have a long history as a modern civilization of creating chemicals and then not worrying too much about where they're dumped or where they end up. And New York State is a prime example of that. We haven't specifically focused a film on it. I would love to make a film about Newburgh, and this issue is a big part of that story. It has great elements of environmental injustice and chemical pollution and on and on. So I don't want to steal my own thunder, but when we made the Dear Governor Cuomo film, we showed bites of it at a big environmental conference that was being held at Mohunk, and a very sweet woman who came up to me afterwards, an older woman came up to me. I'd never met her, and she took my hand and she said, "Do you need any money?" And because she knew, she was from the philanthropic world, and she knows how difficult it is to fund documentaries, environmental films, etc. So yeah, there are incredible stories out there. I have a pretty good list of stories we would like to tell. Do look at the HudsonRiverStories.com site. Everything we do is you can watch it there. There's no charge; it's all for free, etc. We're big believers in this, and John Lipscomb mentioned my colleagues Chris Rahm and Devin Pickering. We're big believers that these are important stories and need to be shared, and that there's a lot more out there, and we like doing it. We like the subject matter.
Well, a last question here for Jon Bowermaster. Thank you, John, for having spent this time with us. Thank you for coming out in 2 weeks, our June 16th event, the Summer Splash, which again, I hope you all in the audience will consider buying tickets for if you haven't already. We are giving John our Hudson Hero Award at that event. And so we wanted to end with this question, John, which is, who are some of your heroes or mentors that you look to for inspiration or have looked to in your history of filmmaking and activism?
Yeah, Dan, I like you. I started as a writer, as a print journalist, and so my biggest influences in terms of storytelling were writers. Jack London was a huge influence. I had the incredible good fortune. I grew up in and around the Chicago suburbs, and had the great opportunity one time to be interviewed by Studs Terkel. And Studs Terkel was a huge hero of mine for all of his oral biographies, etc. I had written a book that came out on Earth Day 1990 called "Saving the Earth," and we did a nationwide promotional tour. We ended up on Studs Terkel's radio show. And for any of you who aren't from Chicago, you don't know Studs Terkel, search him. He's fantastic. But when you go in to do these promotional events, usually the interviewer he has no idea who you are. They've not read the book. They haven't watched the movie, etc. It's just in and out in 4 minutes, and that's it. And Studs, he was in his probably 70s when he interviewed us, and he ran around his studio. He still had walls of LPs, and he said, in his book he had all sorts of post-it notes and red markings and stuff. So and he pulled off out of the stacks a Tom Paxton album, which had the song "Tend Your Garden," which is one of the very first kind of environmental songs in the 1960s. He said, "This is perfect. This is what we're going to introduce it with." He knew exactly what he wanted to do. That was a great highlight.
Had some dogs barking there just this out.
Well, they know it's time. That's the signal. It's time to go.
I guess so. So, well, John, thank you for the questions, and John, thank you for the answers. It's been a really nice conversation.
Yeah, it's been fun, and I want to remind the audiences that actually this is such an interesting trio because we all come from storytelling paths into activism, even and maybe especially John Lipscomb. So next time we'll grill the captain there.
I'd like that, and he won't. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
And turn out on June 16th.
Yep. Join us. Thanks.